do you trust
Who do I trust?
in the news?
Oh, in the news?
Why don't you trust the media? You know, what is it that what the media has done?
You can't necessarily trust their word even if they say it's a fact, which is even harder because then you don't know if you can really trust the media at all.
I'd love to just go out and ask people what they think. Sometimes I don't even have to ask. I go to family parties and people are like, oh, I just canceled my subscription, you know? I hate what you guys do, and it's like, well, thanks.
People are reading and trusting you guys, the journalists, to say the truth, and they're not saying the truth.
That we're villainized is beyond me. I can't understand it.
There's a disconnect here. People say they can't trust the news, and reporters don't understand why. While studying journalism at Northwestern University, I set out on a cross-country reporting trip with my friend Sammy to try to figure out what's going on. In most of the newsrooms we visited, journalists follow what they believe is the gold standard of journalistic ethics: objectivity.
We are, at our core, nonpartisan. And that objectivity allows us to be crystal clear about what the story is and about what the story isn't.
I think you can just keep a level head and stay objective and do your job.
You need people who can come to the table and say, I'm going to be empathetic to both sides here, and I'm going to write a story that perfectly characterizes how everybody feels about this particular issue.
If I wanted to be an activist, I would have been an activist. Instead, I chose to be a journalist.
The problem is, the public doesn't buy it. The people we spoke to worried decisions in newsrooms were being driven by clicks.
It's media, so you want to sell your papers, you want to get more clicks, so it's often dramatized.
It spends more time trying to spin it to what you may like, as opposed to just telling you what's going on.
They suspected journalists were working for advertisers rather than their audiences.
In theory, journalists work for democracy, which they do. However, journalists have to make a living.
I hate to sound jaded, but journalists don't get paid by the public. They get paid by advertisers. So I don't know if they work for the public at all.
They thought reporters' political beliefs bled into their coverage.
They slant some things politically that I don't understand.
They always lean one way and don't give you both sides.
Yeah, so I think they lean liberal, and I don't lean in that direction.
They're so against certain political party that they can't even see straight and tell the truth.
And that journalists left some voices out of their stories entirely.
I would change the whole idea of we're being objective and we have to share everyone's story. I'm tired of it. We have the majority's perspective already through so many things. We need to be elevating the voices of marginalized people, and that's just needs to be standard.
Despite journalists' best efforts to stay objective, people's biggest complaint was that journalism is biased.
Just so much bias.
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 Bias. Bias.
Sort of bias.
Bias.
Extremely biased. Bias.
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 People see bias in the news. They hear news organizations claim they're objective, and they feel lied to.
If media organizations are claiming to be providing the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, then of course people are going to feel lied to.
The SPJ Law of Ethics instructs us to be objective in what we say, and publications advertise objectivity no matter how unobjective they end up actually being.
But it hasn't always been this way. If we look a little closer, we can see where the standard of objectivity came from and what it was originally supposed to mean. Right around the Revolutionary War, America got a lot more printing presses, which meant a lot more newspapers. To stay afloat, each new paper had to find its own audience. One way to do that was to be overtly partisan. In fact, many newspapers were directly funded by political parties. But as cities grew larger and publishing a paper became more expensive, the business model changed. Newspapers started getting their money from advertisers rather than political parties. Businesses wanted their ads to reach as broad an audience as possible, so newspapers toned down the partisan rhetoric to keep their business. In the 1950s, television news took neutrality a step further. Broadcasting a news program was so expensive that in the early days, only 3 stations could afford to be on air. Each wanted to attract as many viewers as they could. Their strategy was to be as objective as possible. But originally, objectivity was supposed to be a process. It meant journalists would recognize their own biases and work to overcome them by including as many voices as possible. It didn't mean claiming not to have any biases at all. Today, thanks to the internet and 24/7 cable TV, people have a million choices about where to get their news. In response, publications have gone back to the old strategy of trying to appeal to a specific audience. But in the meantime, news outlets are still advertising themselves as unbiased. We talk about this idea of objectivity as if it were a finished product, but it's not, and it was never meant that way.
You want to tell people you're giving them what they want, right? So, your beer tastes great and it's less filling. My newspaper will break it down for you and tell you everything you need to know, but also won't have any viewpoint about what it is you need to know.
Hearing the description of it being objective or unbiased, and some of the slogans of media outlets have had to do with that.
They say, we've got the truth. Even though obviously different people are pursuing different strategies, they're differentiating in the marketplace, everyone is stuck on a rhetoric of objectivity.
This is an apple. Some people might try to tell you that it's a banana, but it's not. This is an apple.
It locks us into a counterproductive cycle in which every publication, every media outlet is claiming to be aiming for the same goal, even when realistically they aren't.
News consumers feel like they can't trust the news because media organizations say they're unbiased. And yet, biases will always exist so long as news is being written by people.
Journalists are human beings whose biases sometimes show through in what they do. We're not machines here putting out perfectly unbiased or inhuman words.
Before we left, I never thought the expectation for objectivity was one of the main threats to journalism's credibility, or even a threat. But after talking to people around the country, I came to believe our expectation for a completely unbiased press is the biggest wedge between journalists and their audiences. So maybe, if we can let go of this standard, we can have more productive conversations about how we can make journalism better.